Rembrandt, when the 53-year-old Rembrandt van Rijn looked into his mirror, he saw only this aging, troubled man. A man who had known success and fame and personal happiness and had lost them all. And everything Rembrandt saw in that mirrored face, he put on canvas. For more than any other artist who ever lived, Rembrandt painted the inner lives of men through their faces. And from the early years of good fortune through the later ones of sorrow and disappointment, the face he painted more often than any other was his own. In his portraits of himself, he has left us his autobiography. 40 years before, that face had been clear and untouched. The face of a young boy growing up in the country town of Leyden, where his father was a miller. The young Rembrandt worked in his father's mill, went to school, and played with his brothers on the banks of the Rhine, from which the family had taken its name. It was a peaceful pastoral world that Rembrandt grew up in, a world close to nature that he began to notice and to study. For even as a schoolboy, it was the visual world that attracted him rather than the world of books. Before his own mirror, he grimaced and posed, busily sketching the varying expressions. When he turned from his mirror, it was to study the people closest to him, making his first attempts to capture the detail that tells more than any words. His mother's hand, wrinkled and worn, holding her Bible. The heavy lines of work and weariness in his father's face. From the close little family circle in the mill, Rembrandt's horizon widened in the next few years of study and apprenticeship in Leyden itself. His gifts were too great not to be soon recognized, and by the time he was 20, he had set up his own studio. The prospect opened before him of a secure life amid the quiet country scene, as a comfortably successful craftsman, with no great heights of fortune to scale or to tumble from. But Rembrandt was on fire with youth and ambition. His own measure of himself can be read in the diary of his self-portraits. He saw himself now as this debonair cavalier on the threshold of a great career. For a gifted and ambitious youth in the Holland of that time, there was one city, one cultural center above all others. At 25, Rembrandt left Leyden forever and went to Amsterdam. In 1631, Holland, a tiny country of less than 2 million people, had only recently wrested its independence from Spain. With peace and freedom finally won, little Holland, crowded in among larger, stronger neighbors, had no great expanses of land to farm, no great industries to absorb her manpower. But she did have the sea. 11 years before Rembrandt had been born, 4 small vessels had set sail from Holland to the East Indies, the first Dutch ships to attempt the perilous voyage. Only 35 years later, when the young Rembrandt was deciding to leave Leyden, half the merchant fleet of the world flew the flag of Holland. Her sails carried to every port, bringing back all the luxuries of the old world, coffee and spices, perfumes and rare woods, and from the new world, new products like tobacco and furs, all to be redistributed throughout Europe by the mother country. As Holland became almost overnight a world power, Amsterdam grew with her, the proud center of her prosperity, the teeming, expanding heart through which pulsed this golden stream of commerce. And within a short time, something else had happened too. A new privileged class, totally different from the old aristocracy, rose to power. The men who commanded these busy ships, who owned the shipyards where they were built, who bought and sold the carts carried in their holds. Solid and righteous, these kings of commerce were proud of what they had accomplished. In their big, new, comfortably furnished houses, they wanted pictures of themselves looking prosperous and important, and they were willing and able to pay generously. Making a place for himself among the painters of Amsterdam, Rembrandt was soon doing portraits like these of the Admiral and the Admiral's wife. Fashionable likenesses of fat people, things in which friends could point out, admire the fans and pearls of dress and coiffure. He so surpassed his colleagues in the details of jewelry and lace, in the capture of flattering pose and expression, that orders for portraits began to come in from one prominent person after another. Then another opportunity presented itself. A commission to paint a group of doctors conducting a dissection. These paintings of members of guilds or honorary organizations were usually just stiff rows of solemn faces that had no connection with each other as they gazed out of the canvas. Rembrandt, in the anatomy lesson, did something totally new. These 7 men, presided over by the renowned Dr. Taup, are bound together by their common interest in the human mechanism laid bare before them. Fascinated, they press forward to catch the lecturer's every word about it. Grouped naturally, absorbed in real activity, the doctors of the anatomy lesson could be any group of men anywhere in search of knowledge, and the force and originality of the painting caused a sensation. With the anatomy lesson a brilliant success, Rembrandt had every reason to feel confident that a glittering career lay ahead of him. And young, attractive, and popular, he naturally thought of marriage. The girl Rembrandt won was Saskia van Eilenburg, a charming little bride whose wealthy family were the social superiors of the miller's son from Leyden. That year of 1634, the gods seemed to have only good gifts to lavish on the happy bridegroom, who, with his pretty wife enthroned upon his knee, raised his glass to the promising future. The well-to-do Saskia had brought her husband money of her own, and his studio was flourishing. The young husband was able to deck his beloved with jewels and furs, to frame with rich and extravagant costumes the dainty features he never tired of painting. His was the artist's delight in brilliant color and opulent texture, in the glow of pearls and the glitter of gold thread. The portraits, which so pleased Rembrandt's patrons, showed the mastery with which he caught the personality of his sitters, such as the forceful Minister Alison and his placid wife. He was aiming primarily for the realistic likenesses his public wanted, but his own interest was focusing on the mystery of what might lie behind the outer likeness, and his portraits began to reveal more than the subjects themselves knew. In these years, the path Rembrandt was following made good sense to his fellow citizens. He had married well and had found the key to public favor in his work. This elegantly dressed, prosperous man of affairs spent 13,000 florins for a house befitting his position and furnished it extravagantly. But beneath the facade of the successful burgher, the artist was pushing out roots in all directions. The world that contained his beautiful wife and his luxurious house was a comfortable and happy one, but it was too small a world to fill his vision. All of life itself, streaming by in the infinite variety of the busy city, attracted his interest. As great an etcher as a painter, probably the greatest etcher who ever lived, Rembrandt used his needle and copper plate as another would use a pencil and pad, sketching and studying the beggars who came to the door for alms, the destitute and crippled who had been left in the wake of Europe's wars. Here was life stripped to its most raw and fundamental level, a casebook for the study of mankind. In commission portraits, Rembrandt had to please his sitters. With these subjects of his own choosing, he could please himself. Could paint a poor and elderly woman who, cutting her nails as she sat on the edge of her bed, had a dignity and a magnificence of her own. He loved to bring into his studio some workman or neighbor whose face had caught his fancy. Like this man, no Oriental prince at all, but a humble friend, decked out in the fantastic draperies that delighted the young artist. In these paintings, he could experiment freely, especially with light and shadow. For as some artists use color and some use line, Rembrandt achieved his effects by his wonderful use of light. But an unvarnished view of life and man could hardly appeal to the wealthy burghers who paid so generously for flattering portraits. And so Rembrandt found himself torn between the deepening maturity of his art and a very human desire to keep his popular success. Out of his own conflict, Rembrandt turned to the timeless stories of the Bible. He painted Christ brought before Pontius Pilate for sentencing, and gave the center of the stage not to the nobility of Christ, but to the weakness of Pilate, who, listening to the whispers of his advisors and the howling of the rabble calling for Christ's death, is torn between their pressure and the knowledge in his own heart that the man before him is innocent. As the servant boy pours the ceremonial water into the basin, Pilate yields, and sentencing Christ to be crucified, washes his hands of his moral responsibility. Unlike traditional religious paintings of this scene, Rembrandt's Pontius Pilate, troubled and heartsick, was a completely unique personal interpretation. Rembrandt's reputation, the fees for his paintings, the demand for his prints and etchings, were now all greater than ever, not only in his own country, for even the King of England purchased no less than 5 of his canvases, but across Rembrandt's life, seemingly so fortunate, the first shadows of coming troubles had begun to fall. He was extravagant and impractical about money matters. As early as 1637, his earnings were being earmarked for payment to creditors long in advance, and he was requesting payment for a piece of work because, as he wrote, the money would be very acceptable now. And his beloved Saskia was far from well. In the features that Rembrandt loved to copy, the warmth and bloom had faded into gaunt shadows. Watching the sick woman, what the husband felt, the artist expressed, by etching a young married couple who, hand in hand, gaze down at the specter of death that beckons to them from an open grave. In spite of a new soberness in the expression with which Rembrandt portrayed himself, he had great hopes for the year 1642. He had been commissioned to paint the members of a civic guard, and the fee from such a large group would straighten out his finances and help Saskia to get well again. 10 years before, the world had applauded the anatomy lesson. Now Rembrandt set to work again on a group portrait. To the martial beat of the drum, the brave unfurling of their regimental banner, out of an archway and into the street, there poured at full pitch of excitement a flesh and blood band of men ready to do battle for their city. This is what Rembrandt had created in the Night Watch. For this civic guard was actually little more than an honorary club in those years of peace, and its members had expected simply a set of good likenesses in fancy dress to be hung in their company hall. What Rembrandt had done was to make these ordinary Dutch citizens into something more, into any men at any time who must snatch up weapons to do battle for their homes. Actually not a night scene at all, but a street lit by brilliant sunlight, it bristles with all the activity of war. At the center stands the tall captain explaining his plans to his second-in-command. To one side, 2 of the soldiers whisper together, while the man in front of them, preparing for battle, lifts his musket for loading. The powder boy, who has just left him, darts through the crowd with his powder horn. Most natural of all, a little girl coming from market stops, as children will, to watch the brave array. Here is a scene alive not only to the eye, but almost to the ear too, with the barking of the dog at the noise of the drum, and the mingled voices of citizens and professional men-at-arms united against a common danger. But alas for realism, and alas for Rembrandt. In the moment of action, some men are bound to be turned away, some bound to be in shadow. A cry of outrage arose from each practical burgher who had paid the same solid gold florins as his neighbor, and yet found himself somewhere in the background, hardly recognizable. He felt that he was being cheated. One soldier, talking to his comrades, flings out his arm in a gesture brilliantly planned to lead the eye to the officers who are the focal point of action. But the man whose face was cut off by that outstretched arm felt only indignation. And the little girl watching all the excitement, what was she doing in the painting altogether, when she wasn't paying anything at all? The bewildered Rembrandt saw his masterpiece become the laughingstock of Amsterdam, and of the large group whose names were inscribed on the escutcheon over the archway, less than half ever paid the artist for his having made them immortal. And in the same year, when his artistic reputation suffered a setback from which it was never to recover, his wife Saskia died. All that was left to Rembrandt of Saskia was her son Titus, whose charming face, as his father painted it, revealed the same fatal delicacy as his mother's. It was to the care of Titus that the infant girl Hendrikia Stoffels first became part of the household. An uneducated girl of the people, 20 years younger than Rembrandt, Hendrikia entered his life when materially he had little to offer. When in the years following the fiasco of the Night Watch, his earnings began to fall off and his popular vogue to pass. Hendrikia, simple and unglamorous, came as a servant and remained as a pillar of devotion when others more worldly had forgotten him. Rembrandt himself did little to regain his fashionable standing. Another man might well have decided that the safest course would be to conform to popular taste. This man, although he was beginning to cut a sadly different figure now, simply could not. He was losing his interest in fancy trappings and adornment, discarding them as unessential. Now, clothing had become merely background, and even the face itself is only the glass through which is seen the character of the sitter. Sensitive and melancholy, his paintings is the portrait of a personality, rather than a photographic likeness. Rembrandt had discarded other subject matter too. After the early 1650s, for instance, he was never to paint or draw landscapes again. The intense focus of his art had centered upon mankind. In his preoccupation with the language of faces, Rembrandt drew heavily on one rich vein in particular out of the multiracial city, its Jewish population. In a Europe torn by violent religious tensions, Calvinist Holland had become a haven to victims of intolerance. The Jews in particular, fleeing from the Inquisition of Spain and Portugal, had found sanctuary among the freedom-loving Dutch. For years, Rembrandt lived in the heart of the Jewish section of Amsterdam, and their faces never ceased to fascinate him. Rabbis rich with wisdom and experience, lively street merchants, sad-eyed doctors, bearded patriarchs. He painted them as themselves, or posed them as their own forefathers in the stories of the Bible. And always, among their faces, he sought for that of Christ. The present misfortunes of his own life, the depth of his own feeling for human experience, drew him to the figure of Christ as a man of sorrows, a deeply religious man who cared little for the outward forms of sect or creed. Rembrandt read the New Testament with eyes that had studied mankind from real life. Now, for models of the poor among whom Christ had lived and preached, he turned back in his own mind to the tattered beggars he had seen at the door of his luxurious house, to the sick and crippled that he had sketched in the streets of the city. Other artists had fondly romanticized the poverty of Christ's followers. Rembrandt, by the power with which he drew them in genuine sickness and suffering, underscored the beauty of Christ's attempt to help and heal. All his life, Rembrandt was to be concerned with interpreting the tragic events of Christ's life. But it was the full range of humanity that fascinated him, drawing him to the others in the drama, the men and women around Christ. In the furtive night scene of the descent from the cross, a magnificent shaft of light illuminates two figures around whom everything else is in darkness. The broken body being taken down by friends, and the ashen face of Mary, faint with shock. Painting the hour when Roman soldiers have come to arrest Christ, it was upon the disciple Peter, as it had been upon Pontius Pilate, that Rembrandt's interest was centered. Here was the same theme of man and his conscience, For Peter, out of fear, denied knowing Christ when questioned by the soldiers. The knowledge afterward that he had been unworthy and yet had been wholly forgiven was to be decisive in Peter's development, so that the character of Christ is the real force behind the events, although he appears only dimly in the shadows as the soldiers lead him away. Envisioning Christ in relationship to others, Rembrandt saw those others as genuine human beings, saw their story taking place against simple, humble backgrounds, all the more real for being unidealized. With the same terrible searchlight of honesty that he turned upon others, Rembrandt had continued to record his own image. Gone forever was the young cavalier, dreaming ambitious dreams. Gone too the substantial man of affairs, with the patrician wife and the upper-class income. This man was tired and strained, desperately anxious about debts. He knew that his talents were far beyond what they had been in the years when men had waited online to pose for him. But success had long since passed him by, and the public had dismissed him as an eccentric. And to add to his heartache, in Titus's pale cheeks and feverish eyes could be read all too clearly the warning signs of the same sickness that had taken Saskia. Only in Hendrikia, loving and comforting, was there strength upon which to lean. Painting her, Rembrandt painted all her warmth and tenderness, her unselfish loyalty that never changed, even when she was summoned before the church authorities and excommunicated for living with Rembrandt as his common-law wife. The severe rebuke to Hendrikia was a warning rumble. For years now, Rembrandt had been going his own way, independent of the opinion of the world. The storm was bound to break. In 1659, his hopelessly entangled finances reached a crisis. His fine house, his studio with its costumes and props, the art treasures lovingly collected in his prosperous years, all had to be auctioned off for a fraction of their worth, not even bringing enough to pay off his creditors. All the rest of his life, Rembrandt was to be a declared bankrupt, and drink was to become one of his escapes. But if the world had turned away from him, so too had he turned away from the world, into the last and most powerful phase of the art for which he had paid so high a price. All his sympathy and understanding of human experience, everything he had thought and felt in his lifelong search into the human heart, he poured into the paintings of his last years. A haunting gallery of faces, the eyes brooding, the expressions tinged with melancholy. They have cast a strange hypnotic spell over the minds of spectators for nearly 300 years. But his own contemporaries, those who once had crowded his studio, what did they think? The gentleman who sat for this portrait was an art critic, Gerard de la Ressa, who pronounced judgment on Rembrandt as follows: rottenness of effect. Vulgar and prosaic aspects of every subject. Colors that appear to lie like liquid mud on the canvas. And Rembrandt, what did he believe? Studying the aging, heartsick image in his mirror, was he afraid that perhaps the world had been right after all, and he wrong? Or was he satisfied, in spite of poverty and ridicule, sickness and loneliness, content to have gone his own way and done what he had had to do? Did he see that the worn, furrowed face was the face of a man who had created a magnificent body of art, a heritage to the world that would make his name synonymous with greatness? Did the eyes that read the legends of other men's faces read perhaps most clearly the legend of his own?